Thank you for this presentation, which actually scooped half of my presentation. This is very good. I don't have to introduce myself anymore, so we can jump in the crux of it, apart from apologizing for the ugliness of FluCoMa as an acronym, which we will talk about later. So I'll start with the presentation outline. It's a tale from the trail today. I'll share the joys and frictions of interdisciplinarity, which I will call ID, better for my muscles, within that project and in all my life, and I'll try to extract from there a few tricks and a few pressing issues from my perspective, at least, looking at our beautiful field of music technology. So there will be a caveat, as I always do in my presentations, and we will even meta-think about it later. But I'll start with the conclusion right away. Music technology is obviously interdisciplinary, and obviously, therefore, we love it and it's good, but theory diverges quite significantly from practice when you read about interdisciplinarity in music technology. And this is what I'm going to try to extract. But that's been the case since forever, and that hasn't improved since what Barry and Bourne call the interdisciplinarity in one. Now, in our own head, we have all these wonderful disciplines which fight. So that the conclusion will come from a top-down, but mostly a bottom-up perspective, and I will unpack some consequences of those in my fieldwork, and by then I might have offended a few people, and then I will give some specific example from my straight discipline, and then I will have a few enemies more, but that's lovely because it's all made with the idea of identifying opportunities and challenges that we can all tackle together. And we go for lunch after this, so that's quite good. We can chat and drink later. So, first caveat, it's in English, but you can recognize with my accent that I'm a French-Canadian. So I've translated all the slides for those of you who want to follow up with the French vocabulary. And if you don't, it's all written in English there, and I'll try to make it as clear as possible. Those of you who know my music know I'm fascinated by translation anyway. That's why I couldn't, after 18 years of teaching, learning, reading in English language on my field, I couldn't start to pretend I know the French literature. So I have to admit that I've not catch up with my native language. So I stick to English where the concepts are a bit clear in my head, I think. So it's a perspective from a practitioner, definitely not from a theoretician of ID. So I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a musicologist, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a hard scientist, I'm not a soft scientist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not studying perception, I don't do behavioral economics, but all of these things have influenced my practice because I'm an eager person. But the take-home message there is I don't write books, I music critically as a verb. Christopher Small, if you haven't caught up, and collaboratively. I'm not alone. It's a good thing that we're all together. So, to start with, let's talk about what ID is. It's good, right? So, we'll try to depict a great picture of what it is. So, each discipline, like the model, when I start reading, what I read about ID. Each established discipline have a shared culture. They have clear ways in, they have pedagogies, they have aims, they have questions. Now, these strong canons will lead to knowledge silos. A good field will define its epistemic framework, what they consider is a valid contribution to knowledge in their field. Now, that starts to sound a bit heavy, but as an example, the output of research, a theory, a book, an algorithm, or performance are all valid ways of transferring some knowledge that's been acquired through research, not necessarily science. Such epistemic commitments are converging within each field. So each of these fields will try to reinforce what they think is good research and good knowledge. And that's quite good. It's intradisciplinary, and you can do intradisciplinary collaboration and resonance chamber. That's very good to keep focus, create synergies into these specific ideas. But if we believe Darwin, and we should definitely in a pandemic time, it's quite bad for diversity. That's why they try to isolate us. So what they said, like in theory, is that, let's bundle people together, let's do some interdisciplinarity, like that'll be great. That will generate new ideas, new streams, new bridge. They will be love and bird singing and it'll be magic. Now, a bit more space in that slide. Because there are consequences in real life to each of these things, in the politics and the reality, the dirty hands of being a human doing interdisciplinarity. The first thing is that each of these disciplines, with its culture, will have ways of spending a lifetime doing it inside the intra-discipline. So you can be a musician, but you can also be a bass player. You can also be a groove machine, which is a very different type. It's a subset of a subset. If you do programming, you can be a DSP programmer. You can be a music information retrieval production code programmer. And that could be a lifetime achievement. That's really specific. And the world in which we live values these specialists incredibly. Now, first caveat. Second caveat, when you have a strong canon, who defines the canon, as we are discovering in these wonderful times where it's to the fore of the discourse, has power, decides what's within the zone, what's on the liminal space, and also what's excluded from the interest of the field. That also has consequences for people who practice it in institutions, like who gets promoted, who gets published, who's the rock star, and who's the bandit in the corner. Finally, epistemic commitments make cross-disciplinary exchange extremely difficult because it's hard. The more you are in your echo chamber, the harder it is to do lateral thinking and challenge those assumptions which are taken as natural. Now, that word I can't stand anymore. And finally, these new culture from like exchanges, that's quite good, but with everything I've said so far, you can understand that in reality, interdisciplinarity is about culture clashes. It's about the cohabitation of people who disagree all the time. Now, I'll give you an example. I've started all of my academic talks since forever by a caveat, saying what I'm not. This is the ultimate trait of a practitioner of interdisciplinarity. And we'll talk about the unpacking of that a bit later. But I'm always at the wrong place because I'm never a specialist. So, to think about this model in a bit more dynamic way, I was trying to create an axis, because in the literature you have people who are advocates of each of these things, but I've seen very little where they talk about the cohabitation of these things, which is the reality. So we have to think about the duality model, which implies only two things to start with, is useful to a certain extent, but we also have to acknowledge that this is all in flux. It's situated in politics and in reality, and these taxonomies are useful but political tools. And also for the discipline, but all of that comes with inside inclusiveness and not. So you have this wonderful field. I've made little drawings. It's usually helpful. I won't give any of our field. You pick yours. And you do your research in that and your intro. And then somebody else does its own research. Oh, the colors are good. Well, so, and then everyone does their thing. It's really great. Bogdov does a good model of thinking about intradisciplinarity. And then eventually somebody say, oh, maybe we should start to do a little exchange. And you get into that kind of multidisciplinary approach where everyone sticks to their ground, but might throw ideas at each other and think the other ones are wrong, usually. But it's fine, you know, there's a bit of a shaking happening there. And then eventually some people dare to make a project where they have to actually work together. And you get into cross-disciplinarity where the things start to happen. And then people dare to go further. And then you get into this wonderful world. Everyone wants to write in their grant application because you get more money. I'm going to do interdisciplinary research. Very cute. And Georgina Bourne there and Barry, again, they wrote about the conflict base of all of this, talking about agonistic relationship, which is beyond the antagonist, but acknowledging that there are clashes that are irreconcilable. But if we think about NIME, for instance, at one point, the two things merge and define their own field, which is great to a certain extent, brings its own set of problems. NIME is a good example because it also reminds you that within NIME there's a schism, like historical schism from the science to the art, They try to cohabitate, but there's already quite two strands that are very good. But as they evolved, they started to share problems. The problem of gender has been well addressed, or at least brought to the agenda a few years ago. The problem of the V word, virtuosity, I think it's called. Like playing these instruments, who's going to play these instruments for more than 5 minutes? Like all these problems, that communities start to share a body of problem. And that defines new questions, and therefore we are into setting epistemic grounds and defining a new discipline. In the meantime, these guys still exist. And that's cute, because we have two things only. Again, a model is interesting, but the reality is much more like there's a lot of discipline in music technology. And in reality, when we try to work together, it looks a bit like this. Oh, you got the animation. I didn't get it there. I thought it was broken. So yes, this is roughly what we're doing. Like this is the reality, the mushy reality of music technology in practice. So the models are useful to help us as far as they help us reflect on practice, but they've got to be useful to reflect on the practice. I hope you get the nuance. So in what authority can I talk? But I'll tell you about my dirty laundry. We'll talk about FluCoMa, a part of the awful acronym, which I try to change, but when it comes with a big check, they don't allow you to. So I'm stuck with it. But as it was said earlier, we try to integrate machine listening and machine learning in Max Super Collider and Pure Data to enable techno-fluent musicians to do programmatic sound bank mining as musicking. Now, each of these words is heavy in sense, and there's a paper, if you're interested to read, of all our epistemic commitments and our biases. We at least are honest about them. We wrote about it at the beginning of the project. We also build a learning resource, because giving toys to the boys usually doesn't help. So trying to help getting more people in diversity, you need to think about how you're going to get people to engage with these problems and create a community which is online, which helps it being material. What's the driving question of FluCoMa? But if you refuse the romantic genius who has an idea given by God, usually a white man giving to a white man, giving to somebody else, is going to play it, and you believe that composing is, or making music is, you got material on one side and you do stuff with it on the other side, and it's a feedback system where many people are involved and a single person will have multiple hats. If you believe that, the question that we have is where and why and how to place a machine in that process. Does it need to happen? So, you can imagine that with such a project, there are some baked-in tensions. The first one, the concept of techno-fluent musicians. Now, I'm not talking about the buzzword of the title, but the buzzword of, oh, I've heard about machine learning, or oh, what about this, or machine listening, or what about this, or what about that? The intentions as a composer, all the people on the panel that work with us and the early users are all people who have a music practice. These people will have musical intentions, they will have narratives, they will have priorities within their field, their subfield, their pedagogy, their band, their practice of musicking, the way they dance. And all of these are already a diversity. So there's already there potential conflicts, but at least we're in some sort of techno-fluent musicking echo chamber. Now, implementation. And I didn't put like a science there, but let's call it programming. Code qualities. If you do production code, if you do research code, if you work to augment a creative coding environment versus if you actually design your own, if you think of interface as an extension, an empowerment extension, or you say, oh, they just have to learn my language, what are your priorities in coding? How much time are you going to spend in that time drain? And finally, people who do that on this project, there's an engineer or 1.5 who have DSP research question. At the time of the project design, what was the big thing, and it's still quite big, is source separation. And you have conference based on the maths and the modelization of source, even with contests, like measurable contests of how can you separate material. So all of these things are quite tensed when you try to do it in reality. So as a hippie, I had a few solutions baked in my methodology. The first one was, instead of going for, I'm going to have a musician, an engineer, and a programmer, everyone was doing a bit of both. or a bit of everything, in various degree, but having people who already have the idea in their own practice. So they're already inside them aware of the conflicts. The second thing, I have to be honest, it was written before I read all of this. Therefore, I was still very, very biased as a musician, which brought the first enemy of interdisciplinarity is the service relationship. And that's really well theorized by Born, when you expect people to work for you. Like you can imagine a famous institution that I won't name in France, which has one side engineers which will expect the musician to make demo for their technology, and on the other side, a musician who expect the engineers to make tools for their tunes. That is a service relationship. It's an enemy, but it's also an ally. Contrary to Born, I don't think it's bad. It's bad if you're not aware of it and if it's not acknowledged as a problem, but we'll see that later. But it is still something to keep on your mind. Now, the other thing I did is to implement a shared leadership and ownership. Obviously, that enables fantastic discussions. If I'm not the boss of my own project, it means that I will be challenged at the deepest level, even of the design of the thing. But that enabled interface and conceptual frameworks that are way beyond anything I could have done by myself. And we got great result in each field, if I may say so myself. We had some cool electroacoustic musicology paper, some amazing festival gigs, and some engineering results in papers that were just under Google. Considering 3.5 people in a room versus Google, I was quite proud to be number 4. So, or number 5, we have to check the paper, but not too far the top, considering our resource. And finally, we baked in a concept of iterative design, and of the learning material, because you always learn for the first time once. Pretending to know how to teach something is one thing, but the goal is to teach it and observing the teaching, because people who learn it only learn it first time once. And therefore, doing this process many times was time-consuming, but interesting. And that leads us, sadly, to our enemy number 2 in interdisciplinarity, which is the expectations of knowledge and ability. When you are trained as an engineer, I'm taking this as an example, you will have expectations of a math literacy that a musician who can be extremely advanced in max MSP musicking will not have. Other way around, as a musician who've spent so much time on stage, you are aware of the pressure and the tacit knowledge of stage presence that most engineers, if I look at the conference I've seen, should learn about. So, there are things that you know in your field, and the danger is, say to the other person, you just have to do this. The musician who say to the boring engineer, you just have to do a good show. Like, that is so condescending. This is really bad, and it breaks these fragile bridges. So that's enemy number 2. So, was it a success? It's a bit early. We're almost 5 years in on a 5-year project, so I can say that we have researched enabling interfaces of these extensions across creative coding environment. We have enabled some music researching. We have contributed to various ecosystems of the various creative coding environments across all the OSs. You can learn from the framework of the code that we've released. We have teaching material which has been raved about, and it continues to be developed, and it's available for free for everyone to think about. And there's that community of researchers. There's even a workshop coming at ICMC on teaching these concepts. And obviously we're not the first one, but sharing the discussion on how to teach the practice of interdisciplinarity and machine listening and machine learning, or through these tools, could be interesting. And we have a better understanding of our fields, obviously the various tensions by practicing this interdisciplinarity. And we hope to have done a modest push in the right direction. For those of you who think I'm too optimistic, Owen, my right-hand collaborator on the project, Owen Green, is preparing 2 very critical papers on our project and our field, one into HCI perspective and one more into, I think, software design. But he's got 2 papers boiling, which are strikingly more critical than I am. So I recommend you read them too, and you will see what kind of critical thinking we try to embrace, or we have tried to embrace the project by then. The key features of the project, as I said, as you can notice for now, I'm a happy camper, I'm a deluded bunny, and that's very important to have somebody who will lead the project with a positive definition, who genuinely genuinely believe in interdisciplinarity, and that the sum of all components will be bigger than the, what's the expression again? The components together will be bigger than their sum, or whatever. That sentence in English. Although in my project, I read the project definition, it's a bit caricatural, and I'm a bit like ashamed of it. That was quite important as an impetus to get it going. Also, this idea of shared leadership, it started from the interview of the two postdocs. I asked them, I send them the methodology that got the funding, and I say, so, what do you want to ask? What do you want to change? What do you want to do? You start from the beginning. Because I'm in a position of power, if I want equality, I'm the person whose responsibility it is to bring them as my equal. That was important. Acknowledging the service relationship for its strengths and weaknesses. Now, throughout the project, you create sub-projects, and in a given project, one will be obviously more led by one of the questions, and therefore the other question will be subservient, and that's perfectly fine as long as this game is acknowledged and balanced throughout the project. And therefore, you can notice already in my presentation that a candor and modesty is quite important. You've got to be able to say that you don't know. Now, that was great because I was, as you will see, I was a paid ignorant for 5 years. My job was to do that, but to be able to do that as with the pressure of a full professor, you have to just buckle up and use all my privilege of white man privilege to say, sorry, I don't know. That I don't know is really important into creating a community that is based on conflict and misunderstanding. We need to resolve those conflicts. And therefore, the candor and modesty needed there made me a better man, better human, but a person. And then think about the outset from the beginning. That thing is going to finish funding. If you want to create a community, it cannot die with the funding. So how do you manage to enable people to collaborate beyond the box that, yes, it's open source, which doesn't give you anything. Just open source won't help you. So how do you build that in? And I'm not saying that we've managed yet. We'll tell you in 5 years, because the project's finished. So is it going to survive 6 months? It's my first objective, touch wood. And then is it going to survive a few more updates? But we work really hard towards it. We put energy and time. So what's needed, therefore, for ID? If you read in the literature, some people start to hint at that in the last 20 years. But again, the kind of hippie talk is not super popular. But as I said, somebody who genuinely believes that you have a desire to challenge your field's epistemic foundation, to a label lateral thinking. Or as we say in theater, you've got to suspension of disbelief. You've got to accept that you might not get it throughout the question, but see where it leads you. And that's really important. ID needs its own resource. We cannot pretend that a project will tackle 2 specialists in their field and they'll just have like, yeah, we'll do ID. That's not going to work, ever. So obviously, every research is expensive, exhausting, challenging, and slow. That's the whole point of research. And we need to defend that to all the politics who want like short-term result. Like research is about error more than results. So we have to defend that. But imagine if your field is built on misunderstanding. You got to fail and then acknowledge your failure and understand that it might be a success on somebody else's ground. That's fun, but that takes even more time. And therefore, it also needs the ability to be empathetic. And not just empathetic like as a beautiful thing, but in the reality of being academics with jobs, therefore links to promotion, to institutional relationships. This is really important to understand that you work with others. And these others will have their own set of pressures from their field, from their career, from their ambition, from their questions, from their tastes. So, again, it needs, I will stress it again, candor and modesty. Now I sound excited and I might not sound super modest right now. I know my value, that's proper modesty. But I also know that when I don't know, I will be able to tell you. And I know it's a position of privilege, but we need to talk more about these things. That's quite important. Now, that's a lot of information. We're halfway through. You okay? You kept you good. We said earlier that music tech is ID. There are many examples of its brilliance. We can think of like first half, 3/4 of the 20th century, like when phenomenological was happening in many things. You have like the sound object, you have co-emergence of like sound object and the thinking about the dematerialization of music, you have psychoacoustic that is booming, you have like synthesis that starts to sound something else than like, and it's quite good. And it's helping us to think about the blind assumptions of what has been an oral tradition forever. It's cool. Then new instruments start to kick in, like new instrument as a thing. And then the digital instrument in particular, challenging codes of presence, challenging concepts of the V word again, virtuosity. And then finally we're into like machine learning, interactive score, all these fun stuff, which we can talk about in a minute. But again, a child of its time. So music technology is really at the edge of what it thinks. But it's such a wide field. So, and at the moment, it's really quite talked about in this kind of axis of musicking, music practice, music research, and the techno-scientific on the other side. And that's an axis, again, but the reality is much more complicated and one-dimensional problem. Hopefully you know that. So, another question we should ask is which and which music and which technology we're talking about. I'll give you an example of a fantastic colleague of mine in Huddersfield who got a big funding to study the viol. John Bryan, specialist, historically informed performance of the viol consort, and Michael Fleming, a luthier, mastering the technology of making viols. And they worked together on the relationship between what they found in iconography, in various documents they have of the historical viol, the relationship between that and the music that's been written, the density of polyphony especially, because the instrument went from very shrill and nimble, so music is very dense, and suddenly it slows down. When John presented that to me, the first thing, I was obsessed by reverb by the time. It was the time I was working on the Hurt. And I just said like, oh yeah, and tapestry. And he looked at me, he said, yeah, tapestry. Like the acoustic of where the music will be played will change quite a lot, the nimbleness as well. Because the music become richer, the instrument become richer, everything got slower. And I said, oh, is it possible that there were bigger spaces? So you can start thinking about these questions in much more multi-dimensional way. But I want to give you more maybe resonant example from around here. Stuff that inspired me in the last year and a half, let's call it like this. So Prof. Eldridge, for instance, she's got a background in music technology, psychology, evolutionary adaptive systems, and she hears ecosystem everywhere. And I recommend looking at her work. Professor Caroline Traub, who's decided that the virtuoso pianist intuition about something on the key was worth investigating and working as equal with practicing artists. Suddenly there is something that are found on acoustic of instruments. Professor Laura Hayes, she's fantastic. Coder, performer, worked in psychology as well, if I'm mathematics and philosophy, sorry, I don't know her resume by heart, but I know her practice. Fantastic performer working on an active electronic musicking. And Rebecca Fibrink, which has been a strong influence on this project, she started to set up to enable, a bit like we did, like musician and artists with machine learning, and after 15 years of doing it with the Wikinator, which is a fantastic tool, and the way she managed to get the questions at the right place, beautiful concepts like smile data is beautiful data, thinking about the boringness of regression to the mean as artist practice. She is fantastic, you should check it. So, 2 observations. Now, hopefully some of it will resonate with you. Everything I've said so far. The first one is, if our field is so beautiful and rich, and worth of a long life worthy research, it means that we're mostly, all of us, incompetent music technologists. That's the first conclusion. Most of us know about nothing about our field. We know some of it, but very little. But despair not. This is very positive. It means we can work together. It's a reason for celebration. We each have different perspectives on the same problems we're trying to tackle. The second one, which is much more problematic, is that everyone believes they know what music is. That's much more problematic because I was trying, it's very situated. I was trying to make a Venn diagram. You remember my little ball earlier? I was trying to make a little ball diagram to explain how difficult and how we should think about how difficult defining music is. Because we use that word all the time. Nobody this morning defined music. We all talked about it. But all of us have got a different version of what it is. sound, you get into music, that's moving already depending on your context. What's noise, what's music? We talked about handmade things earlier, like the noise industry sending cassettes in the 80s is a very different ways of making what you were talking about than the tweet of today. Technologies, they're not trivial, they're not neutral, ever. So you can either read what Owen likes, Finberg, or you can read what I like, Stigler, to reflect on the definitely not neutrality of technology. And then you have humans in there, and you have culture, subculture, subculture, and then defining what music is there starts to be fluffy. And then if you embrace your humanness, music at one moment can be noise at another moment. If you have a migraine, I'm not sure, even as a fan of Meshuggah, that I would like to hear Meshuggah. And so it goes. So defining music is something that maybe you don't want to lose too much time about, but defining music every time you use the word in a position of authority is very important. That brings me to my first conclusions. The first thing we need to do as a field is to start to talk about the hegemony of privileged Western patriarchal assumptions in our music. Now, I'm a white man, not from privileged background, but I'm okay now. Until they sack me, it's the UK system, that is. So, I'm not saying it's bad. I think we need to think about it. And as soon as you start to think about something, you welcome other people with other perspectives to the table. Some things will hold. Some things might not. If they don't hold, you just narrow your generalization of conclusions. I'm not asking to put an axe in the old music history. I'm just trying to understand there are other histories that needs to be spoken. And, we can think about the keyboard. Have you noticed that the MIDI keyboards are made a certain quantization? We can start, CTM, the conference, the festival, was running an unconference about this. And that's just one parameter, pitch, being quantized with black and white notes. Time, the bloody 4/4. I love it, but come on. The industry-driven, like all that industry is there to make money, obviously. Therefore, they will go into big echo chamber of what it sells. But what sells and why does it sell and why? Reification of emotions in Western cinema music. That's a big question that needs to be tackled, It's not because you feel sad when it's a minor chord that the minor chord is sad. That's an ontological step that needs to be challenged. And it might work for your target market. I'm not against, not totally against Western reification of emotions in music, but I've got to acknowledge the limits. So, now an easier endeavor, still very hard, we need to charge the fields that we work together and check their overlaps. Inverted comma, I should have italicized under. We overlap in aims and question, but not really. We overlap in perspective and claims, but not really. We overlap in definition and vocabulary, but not really. I think you get the pattern there. There's another one. Institutions and position, but not really. So music tech is a beautiful salad, and we're in the same problem that improvisation is at the moment, which is my other practice. Improvisation, the I word as I call it, we had to fight against institutional snobbery, like only white privileged bourgeois Western music was studied in musicology, and therefore we say, wait a minute, we have the right to exist. They bundle everything improvisation in one big salad, and they fought. Yeah, that was good. We won. Now I can call myself a professor of improvisation, and not too many people laugh. But what you do in northern India as improvisation, what you do in back pubs in Birmingham as improvisation, and what you do in New York City, and I've just named 3 things that I'm aware of, millions. What you do in music therapy in improvisation, which is the last time I got a bat in the forehead, what they do is fantastic there. But it's everything that I don't do with improvisation. I can learn from them, but we have to chart the overlaps. And I can go there with knowing that I don't know anything but that overlap in that field, and even that, I might be wrong. I'm just going to be a better improviser, and if we do that in music technology, we're just going to be better music technologists if we acknowledge with modesty the limits of our knowledge, which is where real research, independent of scientific epistemes, is based. And then we need to support these bridges, these fragile things. Like, we need to support these things as they emerge. What's the next immediate question for us? But we need to talk about our institution. These spaces of music technology, we need to make sure that the classic divide is challenged, and we need to foster generalists in these places, not just stack them. We need to think about dissemination channels, like interdisciplinary in music technology would need its conference, maybe, or its ways of promotion, its ways of thinking critically, because just having it in any other conference is either the fringe or the best, with everything else being the fringe, which I will not name anyone, but you can think of various conferences. And then flat ontologies. Remembering that all these taxonomies, all these fields are literally just perspective on a messy reality. The ontology is the messy reality. What we look at is musicking, music making by humans. It's full of, and then we apply models to them to try to understand this. So let's not flip the burger and pretending that the ontology is the taxonomy. No, that's a model to look at reality. But I would say that I'm a practitioner, obviously. So we need to tackle some problematic metaphors. Machine listening, machines don't listen. Distance as similarity, two nearest numbers are not necessarily similar. Artificial intelligence, come on. And computational creativity. Now, I love improvising agents, but they don't improvise. Let's just be completely clear. And then we can talk about what you bake in as a coder in that agent that you've done. That's where the discussion should happen. The metaphor, good for a grant application, but we need to go beyond those. And if you want, I can give you a half-an-hour lecture on each of those. So I'll grab a sandwich and we can talk later. Because these are the four that I'm fighting against on a daily basis. And then, just to finish on a tough question, in my field, like, I love practice research, but we will need to sit together and decide what is the epistemic claim. What is knowledge in practice research? Now, there's a lot of cool books written about this, and there's a lot of good research and, proper investigation being done on this, but we need to continue. And that needs to be in 101 of anyone doing music practice. Like, not in PhDs, not in masters, like in college, if possible. We need to think critically about this. And if you're doing music information retrieval, I'm sorry for you, but you're not doing music information retrieval, because that's not music you're talking about. And information in music is already a biased assumption. And retrieving implies an ontological object that exists. And as I said earlier, music is situated. So let's call it audio signal archetype extraction, because that's what it is. You find numbers, and then you have patterns in these numbers. And that's good enough. We just need to be careful with the metaphor we are using and abusing. So if by embracing the rich messiness of music technology in practice, fostering dialogues between deep intra-disciplinary research and thorough interdisciplinary research with an empathic celebration of all epistemic commitments, we will get more evolving, nimble, current, respectful, complex, diverse research questions, practices, and answers. Thank you.